This video is all about speech sound development and some of the typical patterns you might see as children learn to talk. As speech and language therapists, we know that parents can make a real difference in helping their children become clear and confident talkers. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll feel that you know a bit more about speech sound development. We're going to start by thinking a little bit about communication skills more generally, because that helps us set the scene for thinking in more detail about speech sounds. To become a successful communicator, children need to build skills in all of these areas. You can see that speech sounds are right at the top, and that's because although the words and sounds children say are the things that we hear, all of the other skills act as a foundation for speech. So if your child is having any difficulty in any of the other areas, that could affect their speech development too. Although it's something we take for granted, speech is complicated. Children have to learn to say all the sounds, to say all the blends, and then to join them into words. And for lots of children, that can be difficult, and it might mean their speech is not always easy to understand. It can be helpful to think of it as children sometimes simplifying things to make it a bit easier. For example, children can simplify by using an easier sound, a d instead of a s, for example. Children might simplify blends by just using one sound. A b instead of sp is easier for most children to say. And children can also simplify words by missing out some parts of the word. Lots of children might say pewter instead of computer because it's a bit easier to say. It can be helpful to have a think about what you can expect at different ages. At around 2.5 years, children will be using n, p, b, t, d sounds. Between 3 and 4 years, children will have added some more sounds to this. F, s, w, y, h. And by 4 to 5 years, more sounds are added on. K, g, v. By between 5 and 6 years, children will add even more sounds. They start using sh, ch, j, o, and some of the blend sounds like sp, st. When children are 7 years or more, they'll be using a huge range of sounds, and now they've added in blend sounds like cl, br. They might also be using th and sounds. Although it's worth remembering that some adults and some accents don't use these sounds, and that means that some children might not use them either. Let's have a think about some typical patterns children might use when they're learning to talk. You can have a listen and see if these sound like things that your child might be doing. Remember that all of these patterns are common stages in speech development for lots of children. Sometimes children might miss out the last sound in a word. For example,
a, be, ba.
This is common for children under 3, and it can make it hard to understand what they're saying, especially if they're talking about something with no context, where you're not sure what they're talking about. Another common pattern is where children use a short sound instead of a s sound. For example,
It done outside.
Again, this is a common pattern in the under 3s. Similarly, children might use a short sound instead of the th sound.
Now I am bored.
This is another really common pattern, this time in the under 4s. Again, it can make children hard to understand when you don't have context for what they're talking about. Speech and language therapists often talk about children using front sounds instead of back sounds, and this refers to where sounds are made in the mouth. And it's really common for a front sound to swap in for a back sound. For example,
My cat is very good.
so this little girl's cat is very good, and she swapped a t sound and a d sound instead of the k and g sounds. This is very common in the under fives, and it doesn't usually affect the child being understood, especially once you're tuned into their talking. We mentioned blended sounds earlier, and children often replace two blended sounds with a single sound. For example,
I buy lots of scary black spiders.
so spying lots of scary black spiders has become a little bit simplified. Again, this is common for the under fives, and it can make it harder to understand the child, particularly when they're using longer sentences and there are more words to listen to and understand. Children might also simplify some of the harder sounds, like the ch and j sounds, which can take a little bit longer to develop. For example,
I am choosing a dummy cake.
so it's lovely to choose a jammy cake, and this little girl has just simplified the sound she's using to tell us that. This is common for the under sixes, and again it tends not to have a huge impact on the child being understood. Lisps are another process that we commonly see in younger children, particularly before their second teeth come in.
We are on the seesaw.
Changing the S sound like this is common, particularly for the under sixes, and once again it doesn't usually affect the child being understood. We can still work out what they're saying if that S sound has changed a bit. Another common pattern is using a W sound instead of or L.
I am going to paint a red and blue robot.
This pattern is commonly seen in the under sevens, and as you can see, it doesn't usually affect the child making themselves understood. We can still work out that this little boy is painting a red and blue robot. It's important to remember that all of these patterns are common in speech development for many children, and most children will move through these stages without needing any help from speech and language therapy. Usually, if a child is using these processes, they can still make themselves understood most of the time and with most people, and they shouldn't stop them from becoming confident talkers. Sometimes, though, children can't make themselves so easily understood, and there can be lots of different reasons for this. For example, children might be combining lots of the processes we've talked about already.
I am ready taught the mud is all dirty.
So this little boy, who's telling us that he's messy because the mud is all sticky, has shortened the S sound to a D sound. He's shortened a word, because has changed into Todd, and he's also shortened that blend sound for sticky into diddy. Sometimes children use more unusual processes that are not necessarily part of the typical developmental process. So for example,
We are playing with the ducks.
so this boy, who's playing with the trucks, is using a more unusual or atypical substitution by saying chaying instead of playing. And he's also using a backed sound for gucks when he's changed trucks, and that's a more unusual process. Other patterns that you might see are
I ought a and a R.
missing off the first sound in words is something that does happen in children's talking, but again, it's not usually part of the normal developmental process.
Hi, or he is called Hoha.
So this little boy, whose doggy is called Rover, has a favourite articulation, so he's using the h sound to swap for a whole range of different sounds. Children who are using these more unusual processes, or who have a lot of different sound processes happening at the same time, are more likely to need some support from speech and language therapy at some point. We hope you found this video helpful in learning about speech sounds and how they develop, as well as finding out a little bit more about some of the patterns children might use as they learn to talk. If you'd like to find out more about how to help your child with their speech sounds, have a look at the next video in our series.